Hello, my name is Miss Kilburn Bond and I work with all the English departments across the Athelstan Trust. In this video I'm going to be talking to you about the poem Exposure by Wilfred Owen, and the aims of the video are to help you to read and understand the events and feelings in the poem Exposure. That's assessment objective 1, so until you've got that it's difficult to write anything about the poem that's meaningful until you really understand what it's about. To explore and analyse the impact of Owen's use of language, of form and of structure in the poem, so that's assessment objective 2. So that's not just understanding the meaning of the poem but being able to pick apart how that meaning has been created. And then finally to look at some of the contextual factors behind the poem, so thinking about when the poem was written, what we can learn about the poet and how these things might help us to understand the poem's meaning and its themes for assessment objective 3. The most important thing to know on that theme of context is that this is a poem that is set in the First World War, and it's also a poem that's written by a soldier who was writing at the time of the First World War, so it's based on a very real, direct, immediate experience of Wilfred Owen. Now, I expect you all know something about trench warfare in the First World War, but just in case you're a little bit shaky on that knowledge, here's a few things that might help you understand the poem. So World War I began in 1914, and at first it was predicted that it would be over very swiftly. So at the start of the war there would have been a lot of optimism, a lot of patriotic enthusiasm that this would be a war that would quickly end and would bring glory to those who fought in it. However, what wouldn't have been anticipated was that both sides would dig these trenches in across France and Belgium, and the opposing armies then became locked in what we could describe as a stalemate, which neither side could really break. And what happened is the war actually went on until 1918, so this quick glorious war didn't actually pan out that way. By the winter of 1917 both sides had sustained absolutely massive losses, and one of the reasons, apart from the fighting, was that extreme cold weather had made the misery and the death toll even worse. It's actually been said to have been the coldest winter in living memory in 1917. So lots of soldiers consequently suffered from hypothermia, frostbite. Many died from these. Many developed something called trench foot, which was a crippling disease caused by feet being wet and cold and kept in boots for days on end. So really miserable time that's absolutely the opposite of all those kind of promises of glory that a lot of these soldiers would have seen at the beginning of the war.
Trench warfare was the defining experience of the First World War, but it was never part of the plan. New weapons like rapid-firing artillery, high explosives and machine guns were meant to deliver a swift victory. But in reality, many of the advantages of this new firepower were cancelled out as soon as the enemy went to ground, and the ensuing stalemate prolonged the war for years. Deafened by artillery, prey to shrapnel bursts, ever alert for gas attacks, death and terror were never far away. Even quiet sections of the line claimed daily casualties, and a careless head above the parapet was asking for a sniper's bullet. The psychological effects of warfare were not well understood, though everyone knew someone who had succumbed to shell shock or had simply lost his nerve. Out of the firing line, the main enemy was boredom. The majority of a soldier's time was spent keeping the army machine running, lugging ammunition, evacuating casualties, digging latrines, burying the dead, mending telephone cables, repairing equipment, and cleaning weapons. British troops were, for the most part, well fed, but conditions could be dire, especially in winter. Heavy rain turned trenches to foul-smelling, rat-infested rivers of mud. Trench foot was a constant risk and could lead to gangrene and amputation. Woolen uniforms were a burden in almost all weathers, and disease-bearing lice were a constant irritation. Many went to war expecting to fight heroic battles. Instead, they found themselves crouching in a hellish warren of fieldworks, knee-deep in mud, beset on all sides by death and destruction. It's little wonder that even today, the trenches remain a powerful symbol of the grim futility of war.
Now, Wilfred Owen, our poet, was one of these soldiers who experienced these conditions, and this obviously influences his writing. So we need to learn a little bit about him to help us understand the poem. First of all, he joined the army in 1915, but by May 1917 he actually was hospitalised in Scotland in a hospital called Craiglockhart that was a specialist hospital for soldiers who were suffering badly from shell shock, which we now talk about as being PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So the mental pressure that he was under led to him having a breakdown. And while he was in this hospital being treated for that, he met another famous poet, a poet who was already very well established, already famous for his poetry about the war, called Siegfried Sassoon. And these two poets became very good friends, and Sassoon gave Owen a lot of advice and mentored him with his poetry. Sassoon was another poet who, like Owen, rebelled against the tradition of war poetry that presented war as a form of patriotic glory and heroism. So you'll have seen from reading Charge of the Light Brigade that traditionally war poetry was expected to celebrate war, to celebrate soldiers and the sacrifices they made. But having experienced the horrors of the First World War, Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, the poet we're looking at now, both decided that they didn't want to follow in that tradition, and instead they are now famous for writing about the brutal horrors of being on the front line and not being frightened of exposing just how terrible those conditions were and just how angry they felt with those who were in control, who had the power. Now, Wilfred Owen did eventually return to the war, but really tragically he was killed just a few days before the war ended, and he was just 26 at the time. But he's now one of our most famous war poets. Lots of his poems famous. I'd encourage you to go and read more about him and read more of his poems. But it's Exposure that we need to look at now. And Exposure was written in 1918 and was inspired by Owen's experience in that winter that we've talked about of 1917. During that winter, he was actually forced to spend 2 days in freezing cold conditions out of the trenches with his men and in danger of both the weather and the enemy. And in his own words here, this is what he said: "We were marooned in a frozen desert. There was not a sign of life on the horizon and 1,000 signs of death. The marvel is we did not all die of cold." So this is a poem that's based on a real life experience written by a soldier who's writing from his own perspective. And if you remember that little bit of context information that you've had now, then that will help you be able to write about the poem and understand some of the things that are being portrayed and why they are there.
He was sent out to France at the beginning of 1917, and within 3 weeks he was in one of the most appalling circumstances one could possibly imagine, when he was sent into a German dugout in no man's land that had recently been captured as a British outpost, and he had to keep his platoon there for 50 hours, he said, under constant shell fire, expecting at any minute to be buried alive. The place was slowly flooding with rainwater, with the water rising above their knees, so that at any moment they might have been buried or drowned or just died of shock. They were then taken out for a short period, put back in again in a quite different situation on the top of a hill in very hard frost. So it had been heavy rain and mud, but now it was bitter frost, and they were out on the snow, exposed, unable to move. One man in his platoon froze to death, and he was eventually almost killed by a shell that dropped near his head while he was asleep, and he was blown into the air, and that finally broke his nerve.
My subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity. All a poet can do today is warn. That is why true poets must be truthful.
Okay, so if you haven't already got a copy of the poem in front of you, you now need to pause the video and get that organised. So a good idea to have your anthology in front of you, highlighters, pencils, pens, so you can start to annotate the poem as we go through it in more detail. What we're going to do now is listen to a dramatic reading of the poem, and I suggest that you read along or simply listen the first time round and then again pause this video and read the poem yourself several times, because every time you read it, it's going to sink in that little bit more and you're going to feel more and more confident with how the poem sounds and feels.
Exposure by Wilfred Owen. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low, drooping flares confuse our memories of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous. But nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gust tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off, like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts. Rain soaks and clouds sag stormy. Dawn massing in the east, a melancholy army attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. But nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow. With sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew, we watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance. But nothing happens. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams. Stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires, glozed with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there, for hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs. Shutters and doors, all closed. On us, the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever sun smile true on child or field or fruit. For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore not loath, we lie out here. Therefore we're born. For love of God seems dying. Tonight his frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands, puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party, picks and shovels in the shaking grasp. Pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens.
Okay, so let's start looking at the title first of all, because titles of poems are there for a reason. Don't overlook them. Make sure whenever you're looking at a poem that you think about how the title influences your understanding. So we're going to look at this word exposure. Now what's interesting and clever about giving this as a title to the poem is exposure has got several different meanings, and they all allow us to see different things about this poem and what it's going to achieve. So let's look at just 4 definitions here of exposure, which is a noun. We can look at exposure as being a noun of experience, the fact of experiencing something or being affected by it because of being in a particular situation or place. Now if we put this onto the poem, we've got a soldier experiencing being on the front line in the First World War. So at one level, exposure suggests the exposure of the soldiers to conflict. But exposure can also be about making something public, the fact of something bad that someone has done being made public. And this is a really interesting take on the title and how it changes how we might see this poem, because in exposure, what Wilfred Owen is doing for his readers is he is exposing these terrible conditions that the soldiers are being left in. And we know that Owen was angry with the way that the war was led, angry that these soldiers were left to die, were left in these horrific conditions, abandoned or seemingly abandoned by people from home. They didn't end up in the situation they felt they'd been promised they would be in. So we can look at the poem as a way of thinking about that bitterness, that anger, exposing that something bad has been done to the soldiers, that they've been neglected, mistreated in some way. Exposure can also be linked to the idea of attention, the fact of an event or information being often discussed in newspapers, etc. So he's now giving the story of the soldiers the exposure he thinks that they need for people to change their views on patriotism, on the way that soldiers are portrayed. And finally, exposure also refers to an illness that links to the cold weather, because actually exposure can also be used to name a serious medical condition that's caused by being outside in very cold weather. And essentially that's what happens in this poem. These soldiers, what ends up being the danger to their life is actually that extremely cold weather. So it's a really clever title because it works in lots of different ways that help us understand both what the poem's about, but also the emotions behind the poem. So we're going to go through each stanza at a time. You'll notice at the bottom of the slide there's sometimes a little book saying literary terms. If I'm using any techniques that are given technical names that I might be referring to, I've just put a definition down there to help you. Hopefully they're words you might have come across in your lessons, but you can obviously always go and look into more detail into any of these techniques if you're a little unsure. So let's look at stanza 1. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. So there's our first line. Now we're immediately in this poem thrown into a very bleak landscape. So we're on these battlefields in France. It's incredibly miserable, painful, is not a happy or a safe place to be. And this focus on that idea of misery pervades the poem, goes through every single line of the entire poem. And we start with a collective pronoun, our brains ache. This is a poem that's written in first person, so it's as if the speaker, presumably Owen, is telling us his story, but he's often using these collective pronouns, words like us, we, and our. And the effect of that is whilst he might be talking about his experience, he's talking about presenting himself as if he represents all other soldiers. This is not just something that's happened to one or a couple of people. This is the general experience of soldiers in the First World War, and that makes the messages of the poem even more powerful. So, our brains ache. That could be a physical aching like a headache. It could be also linked to the psychological impact of the war. Remember, this poet is a poet who suffered from PTSD, from shell shock himself. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. So merciless kind of suggesting having no feelings, no sympathy for these soldiers. And the thing that's being described as merciless is actually the wind. Now, we can't talk about this first stanza without using the word personification, because what happens in this poem is the weather is personified as if it's a person, and it comes across as a person who's in battle, who's almost the enemy, who's trying to hurt the soldiers. And this idea that the enemy is actually nature, is this hostile environment, is a really interesting one that goes through the poem. So, what's actually kniving the soldiers is this freezing cold easterly wind. And this idea continues. Wearied, so really exhausted, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low, drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. So we've got these exhausted soldiers now who are desperately trying to stay awake. And it might initially sound confusing. Why try and stay awake if the night is silent? But the silence is all part of the unease, is the idea that even the silence is worrying, is threatening, makes these soldiers feel that danger could happen at any moment. And what Owen does in this poem, very deliberately, is he builds tension all the time. There's this constant feeling that something is about to happen for these weary, worried, terrified, freezing cold soldiers. So low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Everything is unsettling and confusing to these soldiers in this moment. The salient being a section of the trenches that's reached into the enemy lines. So they're in immediate danger from the enemy. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous. But nothing happens. Now hopefully you notice the sibilants in that line, the sibilants being the repetition of a s sound. So we've got silent, sentries, whisper, curious and nervous. And these are not here accidentally. Owen's very cleverly put these sounds into the poem because that sound, that sibilance, helps us imagine these whispering, terrified soldiers who are trying to stay silent and in extremely sort of pressurised, dangerous environment. So everything is building up this terrifying sense of tension, that everything's against them. Nature's against them, the enemy's against them, the physical enemy of the other soldiers on the other side in the other trench. And then, after these 4 lines of building up this tension, we get this last line that we're going to talk about a lot because it's going to keep coming back and keep being important. But nothing happens. Now just physically, when you look at that on the page, it looks really different to the rest of the stanza, doesn't it? It's a really short, simple sentence. And again, that's deliberate and it's very clever, because having built up the tension, having built this really rich imagery of just how miserable it is to be on the trench, then suddenly Owen strips all of that away and just gives us this factual sentence that actually, in spite of all this fear and terror and freezing cold conditions, nothing happens. And this is going to symbolise the agony of these soldiers, the agony of waiting for something to happen. They don't really want something to happen, because what happens is likely to be something that's going to kill them or certainly put them in danger of death. But at the same time, they're living out their existence, the agony of waiting for something to happen. Okay, so on to stanza 2. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. So this is a really haunting, violent image we've got here through the simile, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. So what's being compared to the twitching agonies of men among the brambles is the sound of the wind as it tugs on the wire. And the wire that's being referred to here is barbed wire that would have tracked along the trenches. And sadly, if you read about the experience of the First World War, often the barbed wire, whilst it was meant to be a form of defence, ended up being part of the problem for soldiers, with really terrifying stories of soldiers being caught up in the barbed wire once they were injured, and it being difficult to retrieve them from there, so often dying caught up in the wire, very painful death obviously. So what Owen does at the start of this stanza, he talks again about the weather, about nature being something threatening and violent, the mad gusts tugging on the wire, and then he compares it to a dying soldier. So he's constantly reminding us that death is always close, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly meaning it never stops, there's no escape from it. The flickering gunnery rumbles, far off, like a dull rumour of some other war. So we've got another simile here, like a dull rumour of some other war. And what's interesting is the war, the actual fighting, is always present in this poem, but it's not really the main issue. It's not the thing that's causing these soldiers the most problem at the moment. And that idea that it's like a dull rumour, something that they know is happening, they've heard about, but it's not really the thing that they're most terrified of at the moment, is really important to understanding this poem. There's a brilliant sensory attack in this stanza, and throughout the poem really there's lots of sensory imagery. So we've got this idea of hearing the sound. In the first stanza we had all the light, the drooping flares confusing memory. There we had sight. Now we've got hearing, the dull rumour of the gunnery in the distance. So all of these things are bringing in this brilliant sensory imagery to make this sound like an even more intense experience. And in the middle of this intense experience, we get this rhetorical question: what are we doing here? Stanza 1 ended with that short sentence, but nothing happens. Now we've got a different simplicity in that last line. What are we doing here? It's a really powerful question. Now, Owen doesn't give an answer, and there isn't an answer, and that's part of the poem's message, that it's very difficult to understand how all these soldiers have ended up being allowed to be put in this danger, in this situation. There doesn't even feel like there's a clear reason for what they're doing, and that makes it even more sad. So misery continues, even using the word at the start of this third stanza. The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. Poignant meaning painfully sad. Now normally, in traditional literature certainly, dawn is often used as being a symbol of hope, the start of a new day, the sun coming up, everything being optimistic. But Owen takes that image that's used so traditionally and deliberately subverts it and makes it something that's linked to extreme sadness and misery. Every new day just becomes a new agony. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. So again, everything around these soldiers is symbolising something that is difficult to endure. War lasts, there's no sense of an ending. It's the only certainty in the poem. He couldn't answer the question, what are we doing here? But he can answer this question with certainty, that war will last. So there's this sense of no escape, the persistence of being in danger. Then we've got the soaking rain and the clouds sagging stormy, so this constant heavy weather that's threatening them. Dawn, massing in the east, her melancholy army, attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey, but nothing happens. So more personification here. Dawn, again, usually this positive, optimistic concept, is now being personified as the leader of this melancholy army. So melancholy, another word for sort of extreme sadness. And dawn is seen as again something that's attacking, something that's threatening, and attacking this army that's full of shivering ranks of grey. The men, the soldiers, have been reduced to just a colour, a shivering mass of greyness. So again, everything in this poem takes on that misery. You might have noticed some of the sounds of the words in this stanza as well. We've got assonance here, so a long O sound in words like soak and grow and know. And these sounds emphasise this idea of there being a slow, tedious wait for something to occur. And you'll notice the repetition of what does occur, and that's nothing. But nothing happens, exactly the same as how we ended that first stanza. So you can see there's this building feeling that these soldiers live in terror day in, day out, just waiting for death. And there's an implicit criticism from Owen that this is about the futility of war, that actually war seems futile, it means meaningless, it's just unnecessary waiting and suffering and then certain death. So a monotony of experience, everything feels the same. Now, at the start of this fourth stanza, we see that word sudden, and normally that's a word that suggests to us that something is going to happen, that actually maybe these soldiers are about to be thrust into action and things are going to change, which is exactly how they live, knowing that at any moment that could happen. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. Less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. So what actually happens here, it's almost like Owen plays a trick on us as the reader. He introduces this sense that something suddenly is going to happen. We've got that sibilance again and lots of alliteration that makes this speed up compared to the assonance that we had in the last stanza. So we've gone from the slow grow and know and soak to sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, and that sibilance suggesting the sound of the bullets streaking past and the speed of things changing again. But these bullets that are streaking past them and could potentially kill them are actually less deadly than the air. And that's because the air is so cold. The air is personified as shuddering black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. So it's this endless sense of this freezing cold snow that's constantly posing this grim threat to them again is actually more deadly than the bullets. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance. So there's brilliant alliteration in here, again varying the speed and the energy in the poem through the sound of it. There's no glory, there's no heroism in soldiers watching the snow. This isn't about soldiers showing that they're being brave and heroic and filled with action. Instead, we see these weary, tired soldiers who are watching the wind blow these snowflakes around, knowing that this could be the thing that signals their death more than the bullets that are flying past them. Nonchalance means uncaring, and even the wind seems to be uncaring towards the soldiers. It's like everything in this poem wants to see these soldiers hurt, and the soldiers are becoming increasingly isolated from everything around them. They just seem to be victims of everything. And then again we have this repetition, but nothing happens, and the overall meaninglessness of war just keeps being thrown back at us every time we come to this short and last line of the stanza. We're reminded of this blunt reality. Nothing happens. And that's what the war was like for a lot of soldiers. Just boredom, frustration, waiting to try and make sense of what might actually happen except for death. So we stick with the deadly weather theme again. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. So more alliteration here through that F. We've got the snow, the pale flakes with fingering stealth. Nature becomes a killer. It sounds like it's deliberately coming for them and is feeling for their faces, looking to find them, to cause pain, to create hypothermia. We cringe in holes, and it's a brilliant image of absolutely terrified animals cringing in holes, the soldiers being reduced to these terrified animal beings. Back on forgotten dreams and stare snow-dazed deep into grassier ditches. So we get again this sense of hopelessness, that their life is short, is wasted, their dreams have been forgotten, the dreams that they might once have had as people before they joined up, before they were on the front line, are now forgotten. They seem pointless, meaningless, because the idea of future's been stripped away from them and instead replaced by this terrifying hiding in holes, hiding from the weather. And they're staring snow days, this suggestion that they're not really alert anymore, deep into the grassier ditches. And then we have this caesura, this break in the line, the full stop, to introduce how it's almost like they're falling off to sleep. They start to almost hallucinate or imagine what it might be like to be in a different kind of situation. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. So it's like a world where nature could actually bring beautiful things, bring blossom and birds fussing over the blossom, is only something that becomes like a strange dream to them. It doesn't feel like a reality anymore. They imagine that maybe the trenches could one day be like this, but it's so far from their experience. And it leads to this confusion and the question, the rhetorical question again. Before, what are we doing here at the end of stanza 2? And now the second rhetorical question, is it that we are dying? So the sense that they are now so exhausted that there's blurred lines between what's real, what's imagined, what's life, what is death. And in this state of sort of half imagining, we now get the sense that their spirits drag home. Slowly, our ghosts drag home. Now that word ghosts immediately gives us that sort of symbolism of death. But it's this idea that in this state, they start to imagine that their spirits could go home, a place where they should feel safe and loved and welcome. Glimpsing the sunk fires, glozed with crusted dark red jewels. So when they go home, what they're imagining, and not surprisingly given how freezing cold they are, they imagine the kind of homely glow of a fire that's dying at the end of the night and has been left to go out. And the fire is glowed, so that means kind of glowing and glazed, two words merged together, with crusted dark red jewels. So this is a metaphor, and the fact that the embers of the fire are described as jewels, as something rich and beautiful, as precious gems, shows how this is a little dream moment where home is somewhere that's really special and important to them. But what they find by the remains of the fire, crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice, the house is theirs, shutters and doors all closed. So the house is closed up for the night and nature has taken over. So in most of the poem, nature becomes their enemy. In this part of the poem, nature, the mice, the crickets have sort of taken over where they belong and are rejoicing in the fact that they're not there. And what we see now is this idea that the soldiers are totally isolated and excluded from a life at peace. Even in rest, even in their dreams, and even in this weird sort of exhausted hallucination, they are suddenly pushed out from somewhere that feels safe to them. And we've got then this idea that the house is theirs, shutters and doors all closed, and then the caesura here with that colon, on us the doors are closed. So what happens is the soldiers, even in their sort of dreamlike state, their imaginary visit back home, they find the doors are closed and they're shut out from the warmth, they're shut out from home, they're shut out from their future. And all of that makes us feel certain that death and doom towards that death is all they've got left. And they're forced, because they find themselves unable to go through those doors, they have to turn back to our dying. So they are returned, excluded and sent back from potential peace to the reality of dying in the conditions in which they face. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, now ever suns smile true on child or field or fruit. For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid, therefore not loath we lie out here, therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. Now, in some ways, what Owen starts to do here is leads to a sort of climax in the poem, but not a climax like we're used to, because nothing happens. And what happens in this stanza is instead Owen starts to explore through the soldiers this idea that they don't believe there's any warmth left for them, that they feel abandoned, that they see the sun shining on others. So they see the sun still smiles true on a child, it still smiles on field, on fruit, but it will never smile for them. So we start this stanza, this penultimate stanza, with this idea that the soldiers almost accepting that for them there's nothing left except for death. And this then links to the religious imagery that we see in this stanza. For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. So the promise of having faith that there will be warmth, that there will be new life, that perhaps there will be life after death, all of those religious symbols have been taken away from these soldiers, and metaphorically God's invincible spring, the idea of there being new life, has been taken, has been stripped away from them. So they find themselves locked out of the doors of home. Now they find themselves even turning their back on their faith, on God. So therefore not loath we lie out here. They're not unwilling, loath mean they're not resentful, they just seem to be accepting that they have nothing left to do but lie out here in the cold. therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. So really despairing, miserable stanza. Remember, this would have been written and read initially in a time where people generally would have had stronger faith than a lot of people do now. So this would have been a particularly hard-hitting stanza, particularly because a lot of that patriotic call to get people to volunteer to fight would have been based on this idea of having faith in God, of God being on your side if you were going to fight. And actually what they're realising as they're lying out there in the cold is that nobody is on their side, nobody is looking out for them, they've just been left to die. And then that takes us to the last stanza, which you now won't be surprised to hear is also one that's filled with misery. Tonight, this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands and puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party, picks and shovels in shaking grasp, pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. There's a lot of emotive imagery in this final stanza. There is throughout the poem, but it seems particularly hard-hitting at the end. So we get the sense of future now. So he has talked in the stanza previously about how faith has disappeared. There's no idea of there being a future of peace or new life or warmth. What instead we hear is that the future is just tonight, is short-lived, and in that future, in this night, the frost will fasten again on the mud that surrounds them and on the soldiers themselves, on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands and puckering foreheads crisp. Now that clearly is predicting the death from the cold of some of these soldiers. And then, as if that imagery isn't clear enough or isn't brutal enough, then we move to the imagery of the burying party. So the burying party being soldiers whose job would be then to go and collect the bodies of soldiers who died and take them somewhere to be buried. The burying party picks and shovels in shaking grasp, presumably shaking because of the cold, but perhaps also because of the danger and the tension, pause over half-known faces. And those half-known faces are a really sad image. Soldiers that they recognise, but this idea that at the end of the day the soldiers seem pretty nameless, that there doesn't seem to be anyone anywhere in this poem who particularly cares about them. The burying party seem about the most caring as anyone gets. All their eyes are ice. It's a deliberately shocking image. Owen wants us as the reader to be shocked by the experience that we're reading about. And then we return to this same repetitive line again, but nothing happens. So in spite of this tragedy, in spite of the death of some of these soldiers, just because of the cold, not even because of the fighting, because these soldiers have died scared, in pain, had no way out, no escape, felt totally isolated and left, it doesn't matter, because nothing happens. Still, nothing has been accomplished. And this is where there's a much bigger picture surrounding just the story of these soldiers in the cold, because what Owen seems to be showing us is that war has failed to accomplish anything on a larger scale. And that's a frequent theme in Owen's poetry, this idea that the war seemed meaningless, that it didn't actually seem to be accomplishing anything, and these men are dying in vain. So there's a really concluding sense of hopelessness, of despair, of death as inevitable. There's absolutely been nothing in any stanza that has given us any hope, anything to lift the poem away from the sadness, the despair, the terror, the doom, the misery. Despair has pervaded every single stanza, and there's been an absolute refusal by Owen to give war any glory or any sense of heroism. And that is exactly how he felt about war and how he wanted to try and expose what war was like. And so we go back to that word exposure. His exposure is to say all that patriotic glory stuff that you might have think is what's happening out here, I'm exposing it as being a lie. This is the sad, miserable, horrific reality of what's happening. And to return to the words of Owen himself, that message, that idea that he wants the reader then to be angry about the war because he was angry about it, can be summed up in this famous quote that he wrote in one of his letters. "I am not concerned with poetry. My subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity. All a poet can do today is warn. That is why the true poets must be truthful." And that theme is something that we see coming up in a lot of his poems, this idea that being truthful meant being shocking in terms of explaining and describing exactly what it's like to be a soldier on the front in the First World War. So I hope that's helped you understand the poem, and also love this poem. I think it's a really brilliant poem to read, and hopefully you now feel like you can start to enjoy it a bit more now you've understood some of those ideas in it. In the exam, you know you need to be able to make comparative links with other poems in the collection. So what I'm going to do now is just run through a couple of those poems and how you might very easily find comparative links between them. It doesn't mean that you couldn't do that with some of the poems that aren't going to end up on this list. I've just tried to pick some that I think are particularly interesting. So I'll start with Ozymandias by Shelley. Both poets reveal nature as ultimately powerful, and there's lots of things that you could do with how the poets have got a message, something that makes them feel angry, and how they use nature as part of how they deliver that message to the reader. In London by Blake, both speakers are expressing a sense of despair about those who are powerless, and then those who are victims to those who are abusing their power. So whilst they might seem to be about very different things, one's a war poem, one isn't, actually some of those ideas, the attitude, the tone of the poem, there's a lot of really good comparison to be done there. In Charge of the Light Brigade by Tennyson, really contrasting in its tone and its attitude towards war, but that's what could make it a really interesting comparison, because both poets are exploring the theme of patriotism, of the glory of war, but we've got one poet who's trying to support that and the other poet who's trying to destroy that. So there's lots of interesting things there, especially because both poets are talking about a situation where there's a lot of death. In Bayonet Charge by Hughes, we've got two poems with a World War I setting, and they both share the feeling of impending death and also portray the senselessness of war, just in different ways. So really strong comparisons between those two. And then Remains by Armitage, whilst written about very different conflicts, we've got two poems exploring the damaging psychological impact of war on an individual soldier's thoughts and experiences. So that's another nice link. In Poppies by Weir, both poems are told from different perspectives, and yet loss of life and the enormity of the gap between the domestic world and the world of conflict are really relevant. So again, you might put them next to each other and think, oh, there's not really a lot there that's the same, but actually that idea that they deal with loss of life and they deal with the gap between those at home and those in conflict is quite an interesting one. Now, if we look at War Photographer by Duffy, we've got the photographer feeling like an outsider, and then we put that next to the soldiers in Exposure, and you've got something good to say there about them feeling like the reality of conflict is something really isolating. In Ruman's poem The Emigre, we've got the emigre forced into the role of outsider by conflict, and that's really similar in some ways to how Owen's soldiers feel. And then finally in Kamikaze by Garland, again we've got the theme of the soldiers as outsiders in both poems, and then this portrayal of the stark reality of conflict as being very different to the notion of patriotic glory, and you can look at the consequences of that and have a really neat comparison between those two poems. And that brings us to the end of this video about Exposure by Wilfred Owen. Hopefully that's helped you to read and understand events and feelings, so you feel more confident about the AO1, you understand what this poem's about, what happens, the overall mood of it. The AO2, you can now explore and analyse the impact of Owen's use of language, of form and structure. And then finally, we've looked at contextual factors, so the First World War itself, but also what we know about Wilfred Owen and how that helps us understand the meaning, the themes, the messages of this poem. Thanks for listening.